Welcome back to SOCY 226. This is Michel Foucault, video 2. I'm still in jail. In this video, I've got 3 goals. In the first, I'm going to look to Michel Foucault's main concepts and give you some examples of each. There are 4. Next, I'm going to compare Foucault's work with that of Marx and Goffman that we've already seen in SOCY 226. This will get you ready for your 2-paragraph response. Let's do it. Here you'll see the 4 Foucaultian concepts that I'm going to explore in this video. They are discursive apparatus, disciplinary power, subject formation, and finally, governmentality and biopower. A word of caution, however, before we start. Foucault's approach was first and foremost historical. In my reading, he was less interested in coming up with a bunch of free-floating concepts than he was in telling a story about how various sciences have developed over time and shaped the present. While I think these 4 tools are crucial to reading Foucault, what's more important is that they uncover the historical present. The first concept is of discourse, or the discursive apparatus. Here I'll define a discursive apparatus as a regime of truth plus mechanisms for acting on the world. So think about a body of knowledge and an organization that acts on subjects. I believe, and I think many others do as well, that discourse is the most important and often misunderstood focus of Foucault's work. When we hear discourse, we think of talking or speech. This gets at part of what Foucault is talking about. He is addressing the different and shifting ways that we address a particular object, be it mental illness or criminals or our understanding of sexuality. Each of these is a way of addressing a particular object, just as you would in a speech. Foucault's interest is in the historical, taken-for-granted knowledge that comes with various scientific disciplines. However, when Foucault addresses discourse, he is interested in the ways we take particular things as true and act on them. In this sense, discourse shapes the object of inquiry. Throughout Foucault's career, he explores the changing nature of knowledge, on how particular things are true, and how we incorporate those truths in acting on the world. The point is that discourse is much more than simply speaking about or thinking about a particular object. It's also coupled with a set of material practices. Not material in the Marxist sense, but acting on the world nonetheless. Let me give you some examples. The first comes from The Birth of the Clinic. In that book, Foucault charts how changing understandings of disease came into existence historically. He charts how medicine in the 18th century sought to understand the course of disease as something outside of the body but manifest within a body, and how this changed to our modern pathological understanding of medicine, as it unfolds in particular lesions in tissues. No longer is the doctor in the way of the natural trajectory of a disease. Rather, the doctor is to locate the particular tissues where the disease manifests. There is a change of perspective. We see new places of practicing medicine. Before, it was drawing up charts of similarities, classifying the disease relative to other ones. Now, the primary site is locating the tissues where the disease can be fought. We need new ways of seeing and places to see the body. This is the birth of clinical medicine. So we have a new way of thinking about disease, but we also have a new place to practice medicine, the clinic. A second example comes from Discipline and Punish. There, Foucault follows changing understandings of prison and punishment and how they shape the practices taking place within the prison. The emphasis moves from the scaffold, the place of public executions, to shaping individual bodies within the prison. Before, the goals were to demonstrate the power of the king in light of the person offending the law. Now the goal of the prison is to reshape the offender. Again, there is a change in the way that we think about crime and punishment, but also a material change in the way that we act on the world. Here we have an understanding of discourse, the conceptual space where particular things are able to be true, and particular things are not, with a set of material practices for engaging the world. Foucault is equally interested in shifts in knowledge as he is in shifts in practice. So there is a change both in the way we think about prisons, the goals that prisons have, and what we do to people who are imprisoned. Inseparable from this is a focus on power. Foucault is undoubtedly a philosopher of power. Wherever we see ways of knowing, Foucault argues, we see ways of acting on the world, and they are forever in contact. Two sides of the same coin. We don't see the knowledge of imprisonment shift without changes in its practice. As I mentioned earlier, Foucault has a productive model of power. Power doesn't simply restrict particular bodies from acting, it shapes and flows through and between bodies as they act. Thus, his model is of power relationships. Foucault gives two different models of power in the chapter that I've assigned today. Sovereign power, the power of the king, and disciplinary power, a micro-scale power shaping individual bodies and actions. Foucault argues that we have a lot of work on the powers of sovereignty, the power of kings over who lives and who dies in a particular territory. When we think about political philosophy, we think about different types of government and the different types of actions that political regimes can rightly take. Here, the body of power is the body of the king. This is to be contrasted with disciplinary power, a microphysics of power. Foucault becomes interested in disciplinary power, small mundane ways that bodies are studied, shaped, and organized to perform particular types of action. When he speaks about discipline, or the disciplines, he is addressing ways of knowing and acting on bodies that seek to optimize them, to make them more efficient, or to alter them slightly in the service of a particular goal. This form of power is not at the same scale as the large-scale enterprise of sovereign power. The scope is small and mundane. Disciplinary power seeks to chart and optimize, while sovereign power aims to dominate and overcome. In the chapter you read this week, Foucault explores the history of military training. To recruit for the army in the 17th century, soldiers would be picked solely on physical attributes. Tall, but not too tall, big, but not too big, of the proper stock, but not too selective. The goal was to recruit particular bodies fit for service. However, military training moves from a focus on overt force to the ability to shape and modify particular bodies for service. Soldiers are not simply born, but are made through small, learned adjustments to behavior. They are disciplined into being. Here we have the two models in contrast. In one, the body is powerful. In the other, the body is constituted by discipline. Time for two more quick examples. Consider the case of surveillance. How we come to be shaped by power, rather than simply excluded by it, is the point of another famous chapter in Discipline and Punish, panopticism. It is named after an ideal prison, thought of but never built, and how we come to adopt self-surveillance. In this prison, we believe we are being watched at all times, and come to act as if we are being observed regardless of whether or not we actually are. You can see the schematic on the slide. I guarantee you'll read this chapter as you progress through the program here. My second example is of quarantine versus public health. Consider the planned response to a plague. Foucault's interest is in showing how the power-knowledge relationship unfolds in the crisis of the plague, seeking to order every minute detail of the lives in the plague-stricken population. Every aspect of life is brought under routine scrutiny, controlled meticulously to control disaster by controlling movements of the population. In this way, plagues are quarantined both by preventing people from leaving a particular territory, but also through the microphysics of disciplinary power. I'm sure you can come up with an example pretty quickly. However, as Foucault argues, we don't just have disciplinary institutions in times of crisis, like a plague, but rather disciplinary power has become diffuse throughout our society. Think about all the different ways that you have your health shaped by these forms of power. Hand-washing ads, safe sex lectures, occupational health and safety training, gym class. These are all forms of power that manipulate you in a micro-physical way. All of this brings us to subject formation. A third aspect of Foucault's work comes in how we understand ourselves and others as subjects. Just as Althusser suggested we are subject to the material order of capital, Foucault argues that we come to take in the mechanisms of power as we live our institutionally situated lives. This becomes clear in Foucault's discussion of sexuality. In the history of sexuality, Foucault looks at the Victorian era. Typically, people say it was an age of repressed sexuality, something before our eyes and something we did, but something we didn't talk about. No, no, says Foucault. Sexuality was something that we did talk about, and talk about quite a bit in the Victorian era, but only under particular circumstances. We talked about sexuality in confession, at church. We talked about sexuality in the courts and in prison, about deviants and perverts. Psychologists and psychiatrists talked about sex in the hospital and in the examining room. Sexuality was deployed in each of these places because there was a new regime of knowledge and a new set of practices that acted on bodies as sexual. We can say this new discourse of sex created new subjects because we acted on bodies in ways that we hadn't before. We lumped people's bodies into new categories, often problematically. We had new categories of people: homosexuals, the masturbating child, the sexual pervert, and the hysteric mother. While Foucault calls this subjectification, an uglier word than any I could come up with, Ian Hacking calls this making up people. Part of deploying sex was making up new categories of people, new objects of knowledge and power. Let me give you another example: university accommodations. In the accommodation process, we have a group of different discourses: educational psychology, human rights legislation, mental health awareness groups that have come to create new kinds of subjects, students with learning disabilities, that need to be accommodated. This isn't to say that their needs are pretend, just that there is a particular knowledge complex surrounding this kind of person in ways that didn't exist before. There is a material process for seeking and identifying as a student in need of accommodation, and all of these are implicated in small-scale power mechanisms. Are accommodations a good thing? Of course, I think so. Some would disagree, but we have to understand that all accommodations produce particular forms of subjectivity, and all of these are made of knowledge-power relationships. This also applies to the considerations process, as many of you are also aware. Finally, Foucault's concepts of governmentality and biopower. Governmentality is a long, ugly word that I think really expresses the culmination of the first three Foucauldian concepts. Here, Foucault is exploring the various ways that governments become invested in the conduct of conduct. States, by this I mean governments at various levels and their institutions, become more interested in manipulating the properties of those living within them than simply instilling order and preventing revolution. The traditional Weberian understanding of the state is that it has a monopoly of violence over a particular territory. Sure, says Foucault, they probably have and still do, but from the beginning of the modern state, there has been a continued and intensified focus on the art of government, such that the health of the population is utilized for particular ends. We live not only in an age of sovereign power, but also biopower. Population emerges as a thing, not just as an aggregate of bodies in a place, but something to be studied, organized, manipulated. Statistics, for example, don't just chart population, they make it. They make it for these purposes. With the emergence of population as an object of government, we also see a change in power. Governments are not solely interested in containing population, they want to augment it. In this augmentation, there is a worry about too much government intervention into the lives of people. For example, in the economy. Note, however, that even if governments aren't acting on subjects, they are acting through them. Let's contrast this with two earlier figures from 226. Erving Goffman, then Karl Marx. Goffman's sociological work complements Foucault. I say complement with an E to bring to greater perfection, because they have nearby interests that add to the other. Close, but not identical. Let me tell you why. First, Goffman focuses on total institutions in a way that Foucault does not. He is interested in the small-scale impression management that we do in mundane life. Though total institutions are cut off from everyday life, they are scenes for impression management like any other. This focus on routine interaction is very different than Foucault's focus. Goffman couldn't care less about the history of the institution, about why particular people are there or not. This is the basis of Foucault's project. Secondly, even though neither Foucault nor Goffman will ultimately believe in a fundamental human nature, how we come up with a notion of a self will vary. For Goffman, it is something carved out in small moments, in tiny instances of push and pull in co-presence. For Foucault, we shape selves in small moments, yes, but the focus is on powers of action and resistance, not the everyday register. Think self in terms of self-discipline. In either case, Foucault and Goffman operate at very different scales. Foucault is interested in systems of thought, relative distributions of power, and historical change. This is big. For Goffman, it is co-presence, and only co-presence, where we need to look. This is small. They are different, but I would argue complementary. They are both looking at the same asylum, at the same time, from very different viewpoints. We need both. Finally, Marx and Marxism. The differences here are much greater, especially because of the importance of Marxism in 20th century France. First, I want to emphasize the very different understandings of power in the two systems. For Marxists, power ultimately revolves around labor. Foucault has a very different understanding of power. It does not only have an origin in the factory. It is a distributed, productive thing that shapes subjects. It exists at the grand scale of the state, but also exists in the small truths that we apply to ourselves. Foucault is interested in power beyond the state apparatus. Secondly, the relationship between discourse and ideology. As I mentioned earlier, ideology relates to the material base, the consciousness produced through a particular material existence. For Foucault, discourse is not an inversion of material life. It is rather the conditions that allow particular statements to make sense in the first place. For 20th century Marxists, ideology became a way to explain the continued oppression of people, even though capitalism was falling apart. It was how capital renewed itself. This is not the case for Foucault's discourse. Wherever there is truth, there is discourse. Any scientific enterprise is discursive and relates to a set of material practices. Ultimately, all of this boils down to the fact that Foucault was interested in the history of truth, not just the history of economic modes of production. Time for me to get out of here. In 2 paragraphs, between 5 to 8 sentences in length, and with reference to the readings. 1. Compare Foucault's discipline with Marx's alienation. 2. Show how power works differently in these two systems of thought. Remember, if you want to do better than a B-, you have to engage with the readings. See you next week.